Here, in the deserts of 2021, the PC parts shortage shows no signs of recovery. Even new entry-level gaming graphics cards have completely sold out, and anyone who has one for sale can charge almost whatever they like for them. When the only alternative is to line the pockets of scalpers, you might find it simpler to hold on to your existing older graphics card for a little while longer, or maybe find a great deal on one on the used market. In this mini-series, I'm looking at a few older cards I have in my possession and seeing how well they work against today's popular titles. The AMD Radeon R9 270X was released in late 2013, though it is in itself a derivative of the 2012 Radeon HD 7870, and was later iterated in a cut-down version as the R7 370 in 2015. Part of the secret of this GPU's longevity was that its first generation GCN architecture was also used in the Sony PS4 and Microsoft Xbox One, meaning even games made today have received at least some optimizations for this near decade-old architecture. The version I have here is an ITX version made by MSI, and would have been a great choice for a small form factor build in the mid-2010s. I purchased this card from a used tech retailer here in the UK for £40 in December 2020. This price has been pretty steady for the last few years, fluctuating only as low as about £30 and as high as £55. If you're planning a build around a card like this, I'd recommend at least a 500 watt PSU with 2 PCI Express connectors, although this specific model only requires one. While this GPU's performance on paper is significantly higher than modern cards like the RX 550 and GT 1030, with still only 2GB of GDDR5 VRAM, it's going to be interesting to see how well it performs with modern texture-heavy games. Before we start, the test system specs are on screen now, and while this isn't the best PC build I have on hand, it represents what I consider to be a good entry-level gaming PC in 2021. The graphics card is most definitely going to be the weak part of the system. If your own PC has a CPU like a quad-core Ryzen i5 or i7 from the last few years, you should expect to get similar performance. It felt particularly on brand for this video to start with a game that was released in 2021 but looks about 10 years old. Valheim is a brand new game that I don't get, but apparently it's quite popular. It's in early access, so I won't be too harsh on it, and this card can give a decent gaming experience at 1080 medium, averaging a little over 35 FPS with 1% lows still keeping above 30. Although Horizon Zero Dawn is a former PS4 exclusive, this card doesn't particularly succeed at giving a console-like performance. The biggest deficit here is likely VRAM. The PS4 can address more of its 8GB of GDDR5 to video, whereas here we only have 2GB to work with. Although the game seems to think we have 4GB. For some reason. This limit means that to get a playable experience we need to drop to 720 and set the quality mode to favour performance. Ah yes, my favourite game at which to suck. 720 low was barely sufficient to give us a consistent 60 FPS in Call of Duty Warzone here. On my benchmark run I only managed to hit an average in the mid-50s and lows of below 40, though as you can see the capture run did a little better. I usually prefer to run Warzone at higher resolutions as Battle Royales tend to involve shooting at a distance, but if you're a stickler for 60 FPS, I think a drop below 720p might get you there. As is tradition with Fortnite, I ran in DX12 at 1080 resolution, with everything set to minimum except render distance, and got an impressive 92 FPS average with 1% lows over 60. In this case I didn't try a run at higher settings, but based on previous experience I'd say it's not worth it. In my Dell XPS 9560 video, I found the GTX 1050 in that laptop gave about the same results as this card does, and it ran epic quality at about 34 FPS. Speaking of smooth gameplay, Valorant runs on just about anything, and this system's no exception. At 1080 high, FPS averaged 170 and never dropped below 100. And spoiler for my next few videos in this series, that's about the same FPS as I got with some much higher end cards. The Afterburner overlay glitched out in this run, but I can assure you that neither the CPU, GPU or RAM ever achieved more than about 70% utilization, so you should expect similar performance on even an older CPU. Rocket League isn't that recent a game, I admit, but it's one I play a lot, so I'm afraid you're stuck with it. Even with most of the settings cranked up at a resolution of 1080, Rocket League glides by at 100 FPS average with just the 1% lows letting us down, and this isn't really noticeable in gameplay. For a complete change of pace, The Medium is a modern Silent Hill style horror game and is a real showcase for the next gen Xbox, so having it run on this was always going to be a bit of a challenge. At 720 with settings at minimum, frame rates start off quite encouraging, but by the time we get to the split screen sequences and the outdoor areas, our frame rate drops to the teens. Cyberpunk 2077 can actually work pretty well, all things considered. Here I dropped the resolution to 720 and used the low graphics preset, which results in averages around the 30 FPS mark. I never played the previous gen console version, but from what I've seen I can imagine this is probably a better experience all round. I guess I shouldn't be surprised, but Doom Eternal is a pretty decent experience on the R9 270X. In 1080 at low settings I managed an average of 50 FPS and 1% lows of 37, and I think dropping resolution to 720 should push those minimums up a bit if you so desire. Forza Horizon 4's actually older than I thought it was, but I couldn't get Assassin's Creed Valhalla to work even after trying to hack the game to work in DX11 mode, so this'll have to do. Forza doesn't like Afterburner, so I'm relying on the in-game benchmark here. In 1080 at medium settings we get a pretty reasonable 43 FPS with lows of 33, though clearly my pro gamer brain can't handle driving at such low frame rates, hence why my driving's so awful. So, conclusion time. What do I think of the card? Well, I admit to having a bit of a soft spot for this series of Radeons, and for a while, when I used to build PCs for friends, the R9 270, 270X and HD 7870 were my go-to recommendations for budget 1080 gaming. That was 4 years ago, and the new releases of 2020 and 2021 are proving a lot more demanding. If AAA games are your thing, I would look to replace this card once the Scalper pandemic's over. The Medium and Cyberpunk are a sign of where mainstream gaming is going in the future, as developers use the new console generation as license to play more with new graphics tech. For indie games, esports and more casual gaming, however, I think there's still a place for the R9 270X in 2021, and if you can get it for less than the cost of a GT 1030 or RX 550, I think it's well worth considering. The only downside from a budget gaming perspective is the power requirements. Unlike the GT 1030, you'll need a power supply with some supplemental connectors. If you're building with an eye towards future upgrades, this is pretty much a given, but if you're building a pure budget system or upgrading a pre-built, then you might have to factor in the price of a new or higher end PSU. At this point, the R9 270X becomes less of a compelling option. Hope you found that helpful or entertaining or at least distracting momentarily from the general miasma of awfulness in the world. Thank you for watching. Kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.